I will quickly introduce our speakers today. We have Biplabi Shrestha, who also goes by Bipu. She's the program director at the Asia Pacific Resource and Research Center for Women, ARROW. ARROW is a global South feminist organization based in Malaysia, works towards an equal, just, and equitable world that enables women and young people to realize their full sexual and reproductive health rights. Bipu's long involvement in gender equality and women's health are inspired and informed by the lived realities of women and girls in Asia. As a program manager at ARROW, Bipu managed ARROW's multi-country program that builds constituencies with new alliances to develop knowledge and ownership of gender, feminism, and SRHR issues by strengthening the linkages between issues that pose challenges to the SRHR agenda, such as but not limited to climate change, conflict and crisis situations, disability, migration, food insecurity, religious fundamentalism, and conservatisms. Prior to ARROW, her work in Nepal focused on capacity strengthening of women and young people at the local and national level on HIV and AIDS. Bipu holds a degree in gender and peace building from the University for Peace in Costa Rica with a full scholarship from Asian Peace Builder Scholarship Program. Thank you for being with us today, Bipu. Our next speaker is Deepa. Deepa is a program officer at ARROW for its program for building new constituencies for sexual and reproductive rights. The program also looks at linkages of sexual and reproductive rights with other issues such as climate justice, food insecurity, migration, conservatism, and conflict. Apart from coordinating multi-country partnership programs on climate change and SRHR, Deepa is also part of the capacity strengthening team that organizes and facilitates training on intersectionality in SRHR advocacy. It is such a pleasure to have you with us today. I will hand it over to you from here.
Thank you, Shruti, for that very kind introduction. And hello, everyone. I acknowledge that you are from different regions and different countries. So maybe good morning, good afternoon, and evening to all of you. I wish we had time to, do a little icebreaker, but I also kind of understand that you have been attending the sessions for last few weeks, or last few sessions, and I hope that you have had time to introduce to each other at least. Today we'll be, of course, as Shruti said, we'll be talking about climate justice and SRHR. And we do have a presentation PPT, but we hope that this will also be an interactive session. We can take questions and also comments maybe towards the end, but if any of you feel that there are burning questions that can't wait till the end, please feel free to also raise your hand, and we'll take those as well. And I'm requesting my colleague Deepa to share the PPT. Yeah. So just for those who are new to ARROW, as Shruti has already introduced us, but I just wanted to also kind of emphasize that we are based in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. ARROW is based in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and we were established in 1993. So we'll be actually celebrating our 30th anniversary next year. Yes, the focus has, since its establishment, the focus has been on advancing women and young people's sexual and reproductive health and rights, and affirmative sexuality, and also empowerment through information and knowledge, advocacy, and mobilization. We have actually our areas of work are multi-pronged. There are 4 domains of work that we are currently looking at. One is on the monitoring of the implementation of the international commitments, and ARROW has been one of the regional organizations who have consistently monitored the implementation of ICPD. But our asks are actually also beyond ICPD, because there are limitations to full SRHR within ICPD framework as well. We also do a lot of advocacy work at the national, regional, as well as global level. At the national level, we work with our national partners in at least 17 countries at the moment. And then we also have a big component of mobilizing communities. And when I say communities, we actually directly work with diverse constituencies from women within the community of women as well as young people. And then we also have a huge component on the intersections of sexual and reproductive health and rights with other issues, and climate change is one of them. Just to I'm just giving you this so that you know where we are coming from. We are not really technically climate expert, but we can't just look at climate issues from that technical or scientific point of view, right? There are so many other social aspects are also attached to that, and that's what we are actually discussing today. Sorry, Deepa, the next slide. This is Yes, so this is what you see here is really our theory of change, but this is not something that so much. There's a lot of something to do, but I just wanted to give you an overview of what we are, where we are based, and what are our focuses as well as our approaches. Next, so before we start, I just wanted to, but before even this, I hope you all can hear me because I can see that my internet is pretty
Yeah,
unstable. You can
before
hear?
it's a bit unstable. So there are some sections that we could not hear in the previous slide.
Okay.
If
So
you
actually,
can just check it once and then we can resume. If you need 2 minutes, we can wait.
sure. I don't know why my internet is so bad today. Hear me now? Do I sound?
It's a bit unstable still, not very clear.
Maybe if I keep my video off, hope that helps.
Yeah, this is better.
Yeah, okay. So no, Deepa, can we go back to the previous slide? Now here I was actually talking about Arrow's work, our approaches, and also the focus as well as some of our strategies as to how we approach the issue of sexual and reproductive health and rights of women and young people in all their diversity. And one of the domains that we work on is on the intersections of sexual and reproductive health and rights with other issues, and climate change being one of them. Because through all our work, we have realized that when it comes to sexual and reproductive health and rights, we can't really see this issue in isolation, right? Because there are so many other aspects that are that impact an individual's sexual and reproductive health and rights. There are emerging issues as well as there are issues that have been there for a while. So we really need to look at these intersections also with other issues. And climate change is one of the areas of work where we have actually done a scoping study actually almost 10 years back in 10 countries, but the findings of those studies are still very relevant. And recently we also did a study in 3 countries in the region, in Asia region. And what we will be presenting here and discussing here are coming from those coming from those studies. Deepa, can we go to the next slide? Yeah, so I thought that maybe we can just start with this few statements and just to gauge what do you think whether these statements are true or false. You can actually indicate it in the chat whether you think that these statements are true or false. Can we go to the first statement? Yeah. So there is a statement that says climate change is an environmental issue and only science can resolve it. What do you think about this? Do you think this is true, or would you like to? Yeah. Right. And one of you also said it's also a political issue, right? And yes, okay. So it looks like you all have do agree that this is not true. This is also a political issue, social issue, and we will dive deeper into it in the subsequent slides. Can we go to the next statement? Yeah, the impact of climate change is same for all. What do you think of this? The impact of climate change is same for all, right? I can see false, false. Right. Okay, so we all agree that this is also a false statement. And the last is climate change and sexual and reproductive health are, these two issues are inextricably linked. Mhm. Okay. Right. So there is a general, I'm sensing that there's just general sense of understanding of that the climate change is not just an environmental issue. The impact is really diverse, and we will actually dive deeper into this. We will actually unpack this, and the SRHR and climate change are inextricably linked, and we are here also today to unpack that, right? Thank you so much for all of your responses and participating in this quiz, but let's just go to dive directly into the next slide. Okay, so this is something that we have all been agreeing, right? Climate change is non-gender neutral, right? So we are also looking at the gender aspect of it, right? This, but like, the understanding of the interlinkages between climate change and gender, it's kind of a little, how do you call it? It's established, right? If people do like, especially if you go in the spaces where climate discussions are happening, there's this general sense of kind of acceptance and recognition that gender is, climate change is not actually, the impact of climate change is not gender neutral. And because it disproportionately impacts women and girls in all their diversities, and it also disproportionately impacts gender non-binary individuals because of the pre-existing gender inequalities that are perpetuated by our social practices, structures, and institutions, right? Can we go to the next slide? Right. So here we are also, we really, I mean, like, cannot understand this interlinkages of climate change with like, the issues like gender as well as SRHR without understanding the frame of climate justice, right? And the need for it. Because only when we actually bring the justice frame, that actually recognizes that the drive for environmental sustainability, it is inextricably linked with the social justice and gender equality, right? Climate justice also centralizes the need of people who are the most marginalized, those who rely on natural resources to ensure that livelihoods and like, who rely on the livelihoods, as well as those who take care of their families, and also those who are they are the ones who are most impacted by the environmental degradation and natural disasters, right? And we also have to recognize that it is a crisis. What we are talking about climate change, in a crisis situation, and that needs immediate attention, both in terms of environmental and social factors. Next slide. Yes. So this is where we are talking about some of the differential impact of climate change. So I just like, pulled in some information that is there in this report, the IPCC report. So IPCC is this Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is like UN body for assessing the science related to climate change. This report has, and this is the report from 2021. I was actually trying to look for 2022 report, but it's not out yet. The draft is shared, I think, but the final report is not out yet. But the 2021 IPCC report, it once again warns us that the climate change is making extreme weather events more frequent, and they are also unprecedented in thousands of years, right? And the climate change is affecting everyone in multiple ways. So even like, the reports are recognizing that. This is because, as I said earlier, the pre-existing inequalities, gender inequalities that are exacerbated during these times of crisis, right? And in many of these contexts, the challenges is really systemic and structural, which means that women, girls, and non-binary people in all their intersecting diversities are at a higher risk of experiencing the harmful effects of the climate crisis, right? People who experience also the multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, such as on account of their ethnicity, caste, race, disability, or migrant status, see their vulnerability heightened even more during the time of crisis. And the ramifications of climate change also impact food security, and also it triggers conflict over key resources. And and again, it goes without saying that the ones who are affected the most are the ones who are the most marginalized, right? And many of these adverse impact also relate to the sexual and reproductive health and rights, because universal access to sexual and is an agenda that is still unfulfilled, right? And this is especially for women and girls who become even more, and that become even more challenging. The SRHR for women and girls especially become even more challenging in the context of, in this humanitarian context, because there are many aspects of sexual and reproductive health and rights that are either least prioritized or or they are not even there. And they are least prioritized even before the onset of in the context that is even before the onset of disaster, right? So and when I say that, there are a certain aspect of SRHR that are least prioritized, these are also the issues such as issues around safe abortion, comprehensive sexuality education, as well as the LGBTIQ issues as well, right? So in the next slide, so, so I'm going to give some example in the context of Asia region, because that's where we work, but I am sure this is relatable in many ways to the other region as well. So this is the context in Asia, just to give you a glimpse of what is happening here, is that the Asia Pacific region is at the forefront of experiencing the impact of climate change and its related disaster. Climate change has also resulted in more frequent and extreme weather events. And if you actually also put an economic lens to it, the Asia Pacific region has its annual loss of 675 billion due to climate-induced disaster. And this is according to the UNESCAP report in 2019. Next slide. So now I'll just unpack the intersections between climate change and SRHR with some examples. And these examples are the findings of the studies that we have done in the region. And you can also share if that is something similar to the region that you are representing, or this is something there are more examples from your region. So as I said earlier, climate change and SRHR are inextricably linked. You all agree to that as well. So there are various examples to that, and one of them being that the early child and forced marriages, right? The effect of climate change are also an indirect driver of early forced and child marriages, which is, of course, recognized as a harmful practice. When extreme events destroy livelihoods, the financial distress of local communities and families can lead them to consider marrying girl children as a coping strategy. And our partners in Bangladesh and Nepal, they have found in their studies that families are practicing child marriage among their younger daughters as a mean to escape poverty brought about by by climate crisis, right? And of course, but here we also have to recognize that this is a phenomenon that doesn't happen just in the time of humanitarian context, but also even before that, right? So another study on sexual and gender-based violence during disaster situation in Indonesia, Laos, and the Philippines also revealed that child marriage and domestic violence occur more frequently in the immediate aftermath of the disasters. And why we are linking it to SRHI is one, there's no choice involved. And the other one is that such marriages increase the risk of early pregnancy, which also makes the girls more susceptible to maternal health related complications, right? There are examples of placental tears, obstructions at the time of delivery, as well as maternal mortality. So this is just one of the many examples, right? In the next slide, we talk about comprehensive sexuality education, which is such a core of sexual and reproductive health and rights. So the access to comprehensive sexuality education, it becomes almost non-existent in the context of climate crisis, with the rise in girls dropping out of school and any other information education platform. So we have an example from Nepal. In Nepal, when climate extreme events happen, oftentimes it's young girls who are among the first ones to be affected, to the extent that they are forced to drop out of school, right? And there's also this increasing workload in the household and economic hardship experienced by the family would cause parents to withdraw their daughters from school so that they could either help out at home or in the farm, or to find a job to supplement the household's income, right? And this in turn limits their access to information, including comprehensive sexuality education, that also further hinders their development, right? So this is another example of how it is directly linked. And the other one, the next one, in the next slide. Yes. So lack of, there are also several examples of the lack of sexual and reproductive health services, because we experienced that, during the time of humanitarian crisis, we experienced a lot of the vital infrastructures are disintegrated, right? And when these vital infrastructures such as clinics and highways are disintegrated by extreme weather events, especially with floods and landslides. So the access to sexual and reproductive health services can be obstructed, leading to negative sexual and reproductive health outcomes in this context, right? For example, women who are displaced and living in humanitarian settings, lack of access to SRS services is the leading cause of death. Disasters also hit girls and women harder over both the immediate and long term, as they are often poorer than men and yet may have larger burdens of care. Right. So some examples that we have from the countries where we have done our studies is that in Laos, there was this low utilization of reproductive health services that are further exacerbated during climate disasters, especially in rural areas, contributing to higher maternal and neonatal and infant mortality rates. Right. There's another example from Maldives, where healthcare services are not available in all islands. For women living in the outlying islands, where SI services are not available, they have to actually travel to another island that offers these services and has, and to also to find gynecologists, right? However, during harsh weather conditions, sea travel is unsafe and sometimes it's impossible. And this often results in pregnant women with either pregnancy or delivery complications being unable to access timely health services. So in the next slide, we talk a little bit about how there are cultural practices that are also hindrances. In many of this, we're actually also looking at all the practices, right? It's not just the infrastructure, it's not just the lack of services, it's also the cultural practices or the beliefs are also very much in play, right? We have this example from in Pakistan, women in the Sindh province, that's where our partners are based. They had more difficulty in seeking sexual and reproductive health services compared to men during displacement due to two reasons. First, there was the unavailability of women doctors in the camps or shelters. And second, women are not allowed to leave the temporary shelters on their own to access health services. And these are attributed to the cultural practice and strict male dominance in the province. There's this climate crisis that also this crisis also increases the incidence of sexual and gender-based violence, including sexual violence and transactional sex. And this sometimes are also related to how girls and women travel further distances to secure food and water when natural resources become scarce. And these risks are also heightened during humanitarian crises and in times of displacement. Right? Pregnancy also presents a biological vulnerability to climate change impacts. So this poor maternal and neonatal health are increasingly associated with extreme heat, smoke inhalation as a result of wildfires and air pollution. And so due to this, frequent marginalization, sexual and gender minorities are also often severely affected by disasters and extreme weather events that result in humanitarian situations. And neglecting their needs in disaster risk reduction policies and practices can also further compound their vulnerability, right? And this is actually in many of the countries, especially in the region that we are experiencing. And this continued the continued criminalization of same-sex sexual activity in various jurisdictions also presents a major barrier to the needs of sexual and gender minorities being acknowledged and addressed during the humanitarian responses, as well as in climate policies and actions. Yeah, and also we see that services like for safe abortion, contraceptive, these are some of the things that we don't even hear, right, unless there are some responses that are initiated by CSOs or some communities, but it's very, very limited. So I'll just, this is the last slide for this one before we go into some group discussion. But I also just wanted to introduce that there is this dominating but really damaging population control narrative that are also being floated around, they're also floating around because this is coming from the fact that, putting the onus of having an environmental or climate change related solutions on marginalized population, and especially women, and especially in the global south, right? This comes from this false narrative that reducing population growth reduces greenhouse emission. This is as if you read the reports, this is a false narrative, right? And this narrative has been used to justify population control and advocate for restrictions on women's and girls' fertility as a means to solve social and environmental problems, which has a very long, racist, and violent history. And this has also led to countless human rights violations. The focus on contraception based on population control narrative has been very, very damaging on the sexual and reproductive health and rights of especially women. Because our studies have shown that it is human consumption fundamentally controlled and driven by the world's elites, right? Not the reproductive behavior of poor population that is putting the survival of our ecosystem and humanity at the great risk. However, the onus is put on poor population and countries to resolve it. So although less developed nations have higher population growth rates, their citizens actually contribute the least to global carbon emissions on a per capita basis. And while they bear a disproportionate burden of the impact of climate change on the health of the planet. So this narrative really has to shift. And therefore, there's this whole negotiation, if you actually listen to the climate negotiations, climate action negotiations, even at the Conference of Parties that is coming up next month. So there's this whole negotiations on common but differentiated responsibility that is still ongoing. So I know that this might have already been a lot. So I will just stop there for now. Yeah. And to see if there are any reactions, any questions at this point, and any comments. I must admit that I don't feel that SRH and climate change is inextricably linked. I don't see the connection that clear. That's why I wanted to learn more about it. Adana, thank you so much for your thought. And I hope that, some of the examples that we have presented have helped you kind of unpack. Yeah, and you have also, now I'm reading your other comment that, okay, great. All right. Is there any thoughts, any reflections at this point? Yes, 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 Vinita. This is something that has been very much yeah, I can see your hand. Yes, that has been very damaging. Like there has also been this forced sterilization, those kind of activities that are also being imposed because the onus is again put on the reproductive function of women, right? So I can see your hand, Mary.
Hi everyone. Thank you so much for that conversation. I think one of the things that I want to appreciate is the fact, as a person who works mainly in the space of LGBTQ people, inclusive of trans, non-binary people and all that, and as a non-binary identifying person myself, I think most of the time when we have conversation about SRHR, and even coming from a country like Kenya, where the intensity of of violations of rights for queer people in general, with regards to SRHR, but now creating the interlinkages between that and climate change is highly a conversation that I think one should be had, but not just in the aspect of climate change. And I just came from a conversation we were having within the Africa organizing spaces, where we were speaking about the Africa we envision when it comes to climate, when it comes to SRH, when it comes to all these things, and identifying the intersectionality of all these things. Because, and I like quoting Audre Lorde in this. Audre Lorde said, and I quote, "We are not a single issue person, people, and we can't, we don't have the luxury to, deal with issues one at a time, because all these things are happening all at the same time." Currently, Kenya is one of the countries that is facing famine, and because of that, there's high levels of anger. And while that is a direct product of climate change, the effects it has on reproductive health rights and services is even higher and deeper, and access to those services is very compromised, especially for people who are living in areas that are which I'm glad you highlighted, arid, semi-arid areas, or areas that are highly hit by famine when it happens. And so conversations about that most of the time have a tendency of leaving, sexual and gender minorities, like especially queer people and then disabled people. And so I'm very appreciative of you even incorporating that, because it kind of seems like a lot most of the time when we have to explain that aspect, especially in a country that criminalizes us as a people. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that thought, Mary. And it's very that's what we're talking about in terms of how so many aspects of sexual and reproductive health and rights um, are are not accepted in many of the contexts, right? And that actually has a direct correlation to how someone is being affected by something like climate crisis or climate related disasters as well. Thank you so much.
So yes, so some of the gaps and challenges when it comes to the interlinkages, right? So first, I think what we've all come up with, and also, from the sharing since earlier, we have come up that, there is a lack of understanding, as well as, a lack of gender disaggregated data when it comes to the impacts of climate change and SRHR. And then even though, roles of women in all their diversities as agents of change, as well as their resourcefulness and their capacities are actually acknowledged in the UNFCCC documents. So ironically, their contributions are often overlooked during when it comes to decision making processes. This is due to gender inequality, and women in all their diversities are also generally seen as victims of climate change, and their voices and needs, including their SRHR, are just not heeded. So these decisions when it comes to climate actions on bodies of women in all their diversities, including their SRHR, they are still being made by male leaders or policymakers due to the patriarchy, due to patriarchal system and structures. This includes the UNFCCC spaces. These linkages between climate change and gender are just not translated to policies and programs, especially those that are gender sensitive and inclusive of rights of women in all their diversities, and as well as in national policy frameworks. Key gender specific issues such as sexual reproductive health, disability, and gender-based violence, they often get skipped easily from planning processes and often have to be traded off with competing priorities. So with this, I'm just going to get my colleague people to close it up.
Thank you so much, Deepa. So maybe since we have looked at okay, what is climate justice and how it is interlinked with gender and sexual and reproductive health and rights. And we have also looked at some of the examples of how they are intricately linked. And then we also saw some of the gaps, right? And it's actually, thank you so much also everyone for sharing your experiences and reflections after the group work session, because that actually really also kind of gives us an sort of validation that that when we are looking at the climate change related issues, and also the Vinita's example of COVID and the challenges while researching, right? So that actually also tells us that when we are looking at these issues, like for issue like let's say COVID, right? We can't just use the health lens to that, right? Or in climate change related issues, we can't just use the environment lens to that. We really have to bring in other aspects also, and justice lens has to be really used for us to be able to say that okay, this is the issue that needs to be resolved, and it's not just about science and health, right? It has to be also the rights aspect also has to be brought into the fore. So how do we do this though? So one of the the approaches is really we have to really address structural inequalities. That's the only way forward, right? But there are multiple ways how we can do that. One is we need to keep demanding that there is a meaningful participation of women, girls, and gender non-binary people in all the climate-related discourses and decisions. And this is a huge gap right now. And when we say women, girls, and gender binary people, recognizing the fact that this is also a very heterogeneous group, not all women are same, the experiences of not all women are same, the experiences of women and girls with disabilities are very different, right? So or indigenous women's experiences, they are very different. So and they are they have expertise, they have the agency, right? So we need to recognize that as well, and we need to keep pushing for the meaningful participation. And if you look at climate discourses, and Deepa has also pointed out earlier how it's the men, and even among men, we know which men, right? So this climate, it's very the debates are very much on science and so, and very technocratic kind of a group that we come across, right? And we see that all these experiences that we discussed, they do not get reflected in these discussions and decisions, right? So that's one of the main issues that we need to address as we are looking at the structural inequalities and how to address them. So there's also this partial and inequitable access to sexual and reproductive health care, which needs to be addressed, because that creates the barrier for the achievement of gender equality and the empowerment of women, girls, and and also gender non-binary populations, and it drives poverty as well as their vulnerabilities are deepened, right? For sexual and for sexual health to advance, gender equality interventions beyond the health sector will also be required, including in the climate policies. It cannot be our policies can't function in silos, right? It can't say that the climate let's say if we have this ministry that looks at the environment, can't function on its own and say that they are actually bringing in climate action that is going to resolve all the pre-existing issues as well, right? So that needs to go hand in hand. Assess gender and climate change policies frameworks to enable CSO engagement at all levels is also important. And this also requires our government to fulfill their commitments to uphold human rights, including sexual and reproductive health and rights. And we know that our governments have committed to many frameworks, not that these frameworks are also comprehensive in itself, but there are some components, but even the ones that have been committed to have not been fulfilled yet. As CSOs, it is also important for us to keep our advocacy efforts really concerted and our networks strengthened in order to highlight the synergies of the intersecting issues of climate crisis and disaster for us to demand climate justice. And we really it's also rests upon us to bridge the silos that is there on the issues that we work on. So further in the next slide, what needs to be done is countries needs to be really ready for specific climate change driven sexual and reproductive health impacts. Like, they have to commit to delivering adequate sexual and sexual and reproductive health services, like for diverse communities and populations, right? There should be a very strong and accessible health system that serve their specific health needs, whether for contraception, antenatal care, or infertility are required to build, they are also required to build resilience against direct and indirect climate impacts, right? Also, the climate change mitigation necessitates that tackling unsustainable consumption and production habits, particularly in high-income countries. But these are again the issues, because the promotion of contraception as a climate mitigation solution, it places the burden of solving the crisis on those who are the least responsible. So we have to keep countering these arguments, and we have science, we have data and we have evidences that this is not true, right? So we need to keep using those data. Universal access to sexual and reproductive health and rights should be incorporated in, I'm not sure how familiar you are with the national policies. So in some countries they say nationally determined, and in some countries there is also national adaptation plans, right? So there are reviews, there are some organizations who have done reviews of these climate national policies on climate actions. And the discussion at the national level or even at the international level is only at the gender in general. There's no unpacking of what that involves, right? So sexual and reproductive health and rights is really, really far-fetched right now. But then there are CSOs like us who are really trying to bridge that gap. And we need more CSOs who is also looking at these intersections. Yeah, so these are some of the things that we actually wanted to share with you. Can I see what's in the next slide? Yeah, so I think we don't need to go through that because most of you were on the same page on these three statements. Deepa, can we go to the next slide and see if there is anything there? Yeah, so these are some of the resources. I also just wanted to highlight that, when it comes to international, some of us are also working at looking at the international instruments, right? And to see if there are any such instrument that we can actually use for our advocacy with the member states or the governments at all levels. Unfortunately, there's no one single kind of an instrument that is comprehensively brings together climate change and SRHR issues or even gender issues together. But there are some components that are you can find in SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, because you can look at Goal 5 and you can go look at Goal 13, and there are certain other goals that looks at the climate change. But again, it doesn't bring these two issues together, and it doesn't look at the intersections of those. There's also a certain kind of lines in the International Conference on Population and Development Program of Action. There's also a few things because Beijing Platform for Action also has some components on this intersection, and CEDAW also has I think General 30, General 30 or I can't remember which gender 37, right? Yeah, so that it actually looks at this intersection. But again, these are not instruments that are comprehensive in itself. But when we bring these documents together, when we bring this instrument together, it sort of gives us some kind of tool to kind of use for our advocacy, right? The other tool that we also want to point you to is the Gender Action Plan for Climate Change. I don't want to go into the details of it because that's it can be a session in itself. But if any of you are looking at Gender Action Plan, there's no mention of sexual and reproductive health and rights in that action plan. But we are still pushing for the implementation of that Gender Action Plan in the climate change related discussions and discourses, because that's our how do you say it, that's our entry point to talk about to bring in the issues of sexual and reproductive health and rights as well. So this is where we would like to stop and see if any of you have any comments, question, or Also, I just want to also kind of mention that it's also a disclaimer that this is a very kind of basic discussion that we are having right now. And because we can have like, we can actually go into the discussions around like, even just like what is our understanding of climate change and all of that. But we are not doing that here because one, the time limitation, as well as like, there are like sessions, larger sessions on these issues. So we are actually not diving into those areas yet.
Thank you, Bippu, and thank you, Deepa. That was indeed very, very insightful. If people do have comments or questions, please feel free. We still have 5 minutes. But I am not going to attempt and summarize the session today. I think what has kind of emerged is that people have talked about um, some of the examples in which climate change is impacting their own contexts, and how maybe in research, I know YP Foundation has done research on this that Vinita had talked about, and I know Frida also does work on climate justice. And if people do want to write more about this as a next step, I think that might be a good idea to kind of see how we can come together, even internationally, for advocacy at the international level. I think it is very important to write more about what is happening nationally, and what is the research showing, etc. So I just wanted to say that please, everybody, feel free to write to me more about it. If you do wish to write a piece on this, or if you have um, some national context, policy framework, or anything else that you might want to just think more about, then it is a space to open the discussion, I would say. And can I just check if it is okay to receive the PowerPoint presentation from Arrow? Okay, so I can share that presentation with everybody then. And yeah, I think with that we can close.
Thank you, Shruti, and also to Yana for having us for this discussion. I also just wanted to add that we also have at Arrow, if you go to www.arrow.org.my, you will also find a lot of resources on the issues that we have talked about. And we are happy to also share with you. Maybe Shruti, we can share the links with you, and then maybe you can share it with the group.
Yeah, definitely, I'll do that. Okay, thanks everyone. We do have a session tomorrow on understanding the reproductive justice framework. So I will see you all tomorrow, and that's going to be an exciting session too.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.